Friends, thank you for being here today. And what if I told you that the greatest transfer of wealth and energy dominance in the 21st century isn't happening in the oil fields of the Middle East, but just a few miles off the freezing, wind-whipped coasts of New England and Nova Scotia? And what if the very politicians who loudly claim to be putting America first are at this exact moment secretly handing the keys to the future directly to Canada on a silver platter? Welcome to the silent wind war. A geopolitical chess match playing out right in front of our eyes, where American political chaos has just created a multi-billion-dollar opportunity for a northern neighbor that was quietly watching, waiting, and calculating its exact moment to strike. To understand the magnitude of what is happening right now, we have to look at a glaring, almost unbelievable paradox currently unfolding on the eastern seaboard. Picture this. You are standing on the coast of Newport, Rhode Island. Look out across the Atlantic water. Out there, 24 kilometers off the shoreline, sits a colossal marvel of modern engineering. It is called the Revolution Wind Project. This isn't some theoretical blueprint on a whiteboard in a Silicon Valley startup. This is, or rather was, a tangible steel and carbon fiber reality. It was a project 87% complete. Billions of dollars had already been poured into the churning ocean. Thousands of highly skilled American workers had been trained, contracted, and deployed. Supply chains stretching across the globe had been meticulously synchronized to bring this massive offshore wind farm to life, promising to deliver cheap, clean, boundless electricity to a grid that desperately needs it. And then, in the blink of an eye, it was brought to a dead, catastrophic stop. Not by a hurricane, not by a failure of engineering, not by a lack of funding. It was brought to a dead stop by the United States government itself. While Washington is currently busy fighting an invisible, seemingly irrational war against its own domestic infrastructure, bleeding millions of dollars a day in broken contracts and idle ships, a silent giant to the north has been paying very close attention. Canada isn't just watching the United States self-destruct its renewable energy sector. It is actively positioning itself to capitalize on every single American misstep. This story is no longer just about environmentalism or climate change. Make no mistake, this is about a massive historic transfer of geopolitical power, industrial capability, and generational wealth. We're looking at how one U.S. administration's deeply controversial, almost theatrical policy has inadvertently handed Canada the absolute dominance of North America's energy future. To truly grasp the absurdity and the scale of this geopolitical blunder, we first have to examine the phantom threat that started this whole collapse. The offshore wind industry in the United States was supposed to be a booming new frontier. Decades of promises were finally crystallizing into steel in the water. But then came the stop work orders in the dying days of 2025. Right before Christmas, the Trump administration, acting through the Department of the Interior, issued a devastating directive. They aggressively halted construction not just on Revolution Wind, but on 5 major offshore wind projects up and down the Atlantic coast. Imagine being an ironworker, a maritime engineer, or an electrician, receiving the news days before the holidays that your government has just torpedoed your livelihood. They felt punched in the gut. They felt completely betrayed. But what was the official justification for dismantling an industry overnight? The administration claimed national security. Yes, national security. The official narrative handed down by the Department of Defense suggested that these giant spinning turbines positioned off the coast would create radar clutter. They argued that this infrastructure would somehow blind American defense systems, leaving the eastern seaboard vulnerable to foreign adversaries. It was a terrifying prospect, designed to shut down debate. After all, who wants to argue against the safety of the nation? But the narrative didn't survive contact with reality. In January and February of 2026, the energy companies behind these projects, including the Danish powerhouse Ørsted, fought back. They took the federal government to court, and they won. Not just one case, they won all 5 legal challenges. Federal judges, including Judge Royce Lamberth, examined the administration's claims of national security threats and effectively called their bluff. The courts found the government's reasoning to be unsubstantiated, arbitrary, and legally hollow. The turbines weren't a sudden, unforeseen threat to the Pentagon. These projects had spent years passing every single rigorous environmental and defense approval process required by law. Yet, even with the court victories, the damage was done. The chilling effect on the American market was absolute. When a sitting president demonstrates that he is willing to use the sledgehammer of the federal government to arbitrarily crush a multi-billion-dollar private enterprise, investors panic. Contracts are permanently severed. The momentum is dead. So, if the radar excuse was fabricated, what is really going on here? If you step away from the dry legal documents of the federal courts and look at the theories currently setting political forums and elite Washington think tanks on fire, a much darker, much more cynical picture emerges. It is crucial to state that we are entering the realm of geopolitical theory here, but these are theories whispered by policy analysts who understand how the dark machinery of Washington actually operates. According to these unverified leaks and widespread speculation, the radar clutter excuse was nothing but a hastily constructed smokescreen. The prevailing theory? This was a calculated hit job, a multi-billion-dollar favor executed on behalf of fossil fuel titans who look at the Atlantic Ocean and see an existential threat to their century-old monopoly. Think about it. Offshore wind provides baseload power that doesn't require drilling, doesn't require pipelines, and doesn't pay massive dividends to the oil and gas executives who heavily fund political campaigns. The theory suggests that this administration, notoriously staffed by individuals with deep systemic ties to the fossil fuel industry, utilize the guise of national security to protect the profit margins of their donors. The tragedy for the American worker, the coastal communities, and the U.S. taxpayer is that they are merely the collateral damage in this alleged backroom deal. The United States government, according to this hypothesis, actively sabotaged its own energy independence to keep a dying, polluting industry on artificial life support. And this intentional self-sabotage set the stage for what we can only call the Great Northern Masterstroke. In the ruthless game of global geopolitics, there is one immutable law: power abhors a vacuum. Where the United States retreats into chaos, litigation, and executive hostility, another player will inevitably step forward to claim the prize. While the U.S. industry is bogged down in endless courtroom battles over whether a windmill is ugly or kills too many birds, the heavily populated, economically vital region of New England still has a desperate mathematical need for cheap, clean, reliable power. The grid doesn't care about political theater. It only cares about supply and demand. Enter Nova Scotia. Enter Premier Tim Houston. If the American political strategy looks like a toddler flipping over a chessboard, the Canadian strategy looks like a grandmaster executing a flawless, multi-generational play. Canada looked at the self-inflicted wounds of the United States and saw the greatest economic opportunity of the decade. Nova Scotia is currently pushing a breathtaking mega project known as Wind West. We are not talking about a few turbines to keep the lights on in Halifax. We are talking about an initial 5 gigawatts of power, with the staggering potential to scale up to 40 gigawatts in the near future. To put that into perspective, 40 gigawatts is enough to power tens of millions of homes. It is an infrastructure project so massive it fundamentally alters the economic gravity of the North American continent. The estimated cost? A cool $40 billion to build the offshore arrays, and another $20 billion to lay the underwater transmission lines. But here is the absolute brilliance of Canada's play, the true Trojan horse of this energy war. They aren't just building this capacity for Canadians, they are building it explicitly to feed the massive, hungry, green energy-starved markets of the American Northeast. In February 2026, an event took place that should have been front-page news across every major paper in the United States, yet it barely made a blip. Premier Tim Houston of Nova Scotia formally signed a memorandum of understanding with Governor Maura Healey of Massachusetts. It was an agreement to collaborate, to integrate, and to essentially build a massive extension cord from the pristine, windswept waters of Canada directly into the heart of Boston. Stop and consider the bitter, inescapable irony of this situation for the American citizen. The United States federal government, citing bogus national security claims and aesthetic complaints about ruined views, blocked American workers from building American turbines in American waters to power American homes. So what is the outcome? Canada is going to build those exact same turbines. Canada will employ the engineers, the maritime operators, and the port workers. Canada will construct this marvel of modern infrastructure in sovereign Canadian waters, completely untouchable by the whims of the Oval Office. And then Canada is going to sell those exact same electrons, the very power the U.S. could have generated itself, straight back to blue U.S. states. And you better believe the American consumer is going to pay a premium for it. The United States isn't stopping offshore wind. They are only stopping American offshore wind. They have simply outsourced the jobs, the innovation, and the profits to a smarter, more stable neighbor. Canada isn't just winning the game. The United States is actively handing them the rulebook and walking off the field. When you look closely at how this happened, it exposes a glaring billion-dollar blind spot. The contrast in leadership between the two nations right now is staggering, and it highlights a massive failure in American strategic thinking. On one side of the border, you have an administration obsessed with a 19th century energy model. You have a president who spends his time at rallies delivering rambling, incoherent speeches about how windmills are pathetic, how they don't work, and how they are a blight on the landscape. It is a policy seemingly driven by a bizarre, deeply personal vendetta against the aesthetics of renewable energy, completely divorced from economic reality or technological progress. On the other side of the border, you have Canadian politicians and engineers sitting in quiet boardrooms, mapping out a multi-decade monopoly. Canada is aggressively positioning itself to become the clean energy OPEC of the 21st century. They recognize that the global economy is transitioning, and they intend to own the infrastructure that powers that transition. They see the wind not as a nuisance, but as the new oil. This brings us to a terrifying, highly controversial hypothesis currently being debated in elite energy and intelligence circles. Let's call it the calculated surrender theory. Some of the most cynical yet brilliant strategists argue that the Trump administration's destruction of the U.S. wind industry might not actually be an accident of incompetence. What if it is a deliberate ideological surrender? The theory suggests that certain powerful, hyper-partisan factions within the current U.S. government would actually prefer to offshore America's energy dependency to a friendly neighbor like Canada, rather than allow a domestic renewable energy industry to thrive. Why? Because a thriving domestic renewable industry economically empowers blue states. If states like Massachusetts, New York, and Rhode Island can generate their own endless, cheap electricity from the Atlantic Ocean, they are no longer dependent on the natural gas pipelines flowing out of Texas or the coal trains coming from Appalachia. They achieve localized energy independence, which translates directly into political autonomy. According to this unverified but deeply unsettling theory, the federal government is purposely crippling blue state energy infrastructure to maintain the economic dominance of red state fossil fuel hubs. If Boston needs power, the federal government would rather force them to buy it at a markup from Nova Scotia than let them build it themselves and break the fossil fuel monopoly. Whether this is a brilliantly dark Machiavellian political strategy, or just the chaotic byproduct of a leader who simply hates the way turbines look, the end result remains exactly the same. The United States is bleeding out, and Canada is holding the bucket. I really want to hear from you on this. Do you think this calculated surrender theory holds water? Is this a deliberate backroom deal, or is it just pure political incompetence? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because this is exactly the kind of debate we need to be having. The long-term economic fallout of this blind spot is difficult to overstate. When an entire industry is decapitated overnight, the collateral damage ripples outward for decades. We are not just talking about the immediate loss of construction jobs. We are witnessing a massive, silent brain drain. The highly specialized maritime engineers, the marine biologists who map the ocean floor, the deepwater welders, the project managers who know how to coordinate a $10 billion offshore build, these people are not going to sit around in Rhode Island waiting for the political winds to shift in Washington. They are packing their bags. They are updating their resumes. And they are moving to Halifax. Because in Nova Scotia, the government isn't fighting them. The government is funding them. Canada is currently scooping up the intellectual property of an entire generation of American innovation. They are building the specialized port infrastructure required to handle 300-foot turbine blades. They are establishing the supply chain dominance that will make it nearly impossible for the United States to catch up, even if a future, more rational administration tries to restart the American industry. By the time the political climate in Washington finally shifts back toward reality, it will be too late. Canada will already own the board. They will hold the patents. They will own the specialized ships. They will control the transmission cables. The United States, having invented much of the modern technology required for these mega projects, will find itself reduced to the status of a mere customer, forever paying rent to its northern neighbor for the privilege of keeping the lights on. But to truly understand the catastrophic scale of this unforced error, we have to look beyond just the immediate loss of American jobs and examine the chilling reality of global capital flight and what defense analysts call grid leverage. When the U.S. government declared its sudden erratic war on offshore wind, it didn't just alienate domestic workers. It sent a massive, terrifying shockwave through the global financial system. The energy conglomerates backing these projects, like the Danish Titan Ørsted we mentioned earlier, do not operate on American patriotism. They operate on stability, predictable regulatory environments, and profit. For the last decade, European and Asian energy giants looked at the U.S. eastern seaboard as the ultimate gold rush. They were fully prepared to inject hundreds of billions of dollars of foreign direct investment into American ports, American steel mills, and American manufacturing towns. But capital is inherently cautious. It flees at the first sign of unpredictable political chaos. When executive orders start flying like shrapnel and billion-dollar projects are stalled by arbitrary late-night decrees, that global capital doesn't just evaporate into thin air. It simply reroutes to a safer, more rational harbor. Right now, the safest harbor in North America is in Nova Scotia. We are currently witnessing one of the most significant, yet entirely silent, capital flights in modern industrial history. European heavyweights, Japanese technology investors, and massive sovereign wealth funds are quietly packing up their briefcases in Washington and flying to Halifax. Canada isn't just financing this massive wind-west infrastructure on its own dime. They are actively using global money, billions upon billions of dollars that were originally earmarked to revitalize the American Rust Belt and coastal communities, to build a sprawling energy empire right on America's doorstep. They are letting the world pay for their geopolitical dominance. If you're finding value in this breakdown and want to understand the global power shifts that the mainstream media is completely missing, make sure to hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. It really helps the channel, and you won't miss our next deep dive. And this is where the chess match takes a turn that should keep American national security advisors awake at night. Fast forward to 10 or 15 years. The Wind West mega project is fully operational. The underwater high-voltage cables are humming. Millions of homes, hospitals, financial districts, and military bases in Massachusetts, New York, and perhaps even further down the eastern seaboard are now fundamentally reliant on the baseload electricity generated in sovereign Canadian waters. Now, we all know Canada is America's closest ally. But in the cold, ruthless arena of international relations, permanent allies do not exist. Only permanent interests do. What happens when those interests inevitably diverge? What happens during the next high-stakes global trade dispute, or the next intense negotiation over freshwater rights, Arctic sovereignty, or critical tech minerals? Historically, the United States could always strong-arm its neighbors through sheer, overwhelming economic gravity. But how exactly do you strong-arm the nation that literally controls the master switch to your most economically vital metropolitan hubs? If Boston and New York are kept running by Canadian wind, Ottawa suddenly holds a diplomatic trump card unlike anything seen in the history of North American relations. They would never actually have to threaten to turn off the power. The very existence of that deep, structural dependency fundamentally alters the balance of power at the negotiating table. Every future trade deal, every border policy, every tariff debate will be silently overshadowed by the hum of those Canadian transmission lines. According to risk assessment models circulating in Washington's more pragmatic, nonpartisan think tanks, this is the ultimate hidden cost of the current administration's vendetta against wind power. By stubbornly refusing to build and own domestic capacity under the guise of America First, they are paradoxically handing a foreign power an invisible economic weapon. We are essentially trading a 20th century reliance on overseas oil cartels for a 21st century reliance on a northern energy monopoly. So, when you step back and look at the final moves of this geopolitical game, it really all comes down to one word: checkmate. Let's summarize the board as it stands today. In a fit of ideological stubbornness, corporate cronyism, and baffling short-sightedness, the United States government picked a fight with the wind. They decided to wage war on a technology that has been successfully harvested by human civilization for centuries. They threw the full weight of the federal bureaucracy at private companies trying to build the future, using phantom threats of national security to protect the profit margins of the past. And in doing so, they handed a golden goose, wrapped in a multi-billion-dollar ribbon, directly to Nova Scotia. Canada didn't have to steal American technology. They didn't have to engage in corporate espionage. They didn't have to fire a single shot. All they had to do was stand back, watch the United States trip over its own shoelaces, and politely offer to pick up the pieces. It is a masterclass in opportunistic statecraft. Right now, while politicians in Washington are busy screaming at each other on cable news, arguing about whether a windmill ruins the ocean view from a billionaire's golf course, Canada is quietly laying the transatlantic cables that will dictate the region's economy for the next 50 years. They are securing the bag, locking in the contracts, and preparing to power the American dream from across the border. It leaves us with a lingering, uncomfortable question. When history looks back at this moment, who will be seen as the true patriots? Is it the politicians wrapping themselves in the flag while actively dismantling their own nation's infrastructure to appease fossil fuel lobbyists? Or is true patriotism about securing a nation's energy independence, innovating for the future, and ensuring that your country isn't left behind in the dark? Canada has already answered that question. And while America argues, Canada builds. Checkmate. If this video opened your eyes to what's really happening behind the scenes, hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to see the bigger picture. Don't forget to subscribe so you stay ahead of the curve, and let me know your final verdict in the comments below. Did America just lose the energy war? I'll see you in the next one.